This is Al Stone with a special report for members of his family who want to know about his participation in the invasion of Iwo Jima. Now, Iwo Jima campaign was 56 years ago, and here I am at 81 trying to recall. A lot of the things that happened there are so deep in my subconscious that I don't think it's possible for me to recall. But I will say this, that I was with H&S Battery prior on the Marshall Islands, Saipan, and Tinian, the three previous campaigns. And as a member of the Headquarters and Service Battery, I received fire commands for the Fire Direction Center. But my assignment for Iwo was to coordinate forward observers from the perimeter of the 24th Marine Regimental CP. At this point, we were right on top of the enemy. The 14th left Maui, which was our advanced base, in February of 1945, and we were aboard an APA transport. When we got to Saipan, which he had previously taken from the Japanese, it had become quite a base, of course, and there's a big harbor there, we transferred to an LST. Now, this is an interesting thing that happened there, I think, and I recall it pretty vividly because it was more or less exciting, so to speak. Climbing down the cargo net to a Higgins boat from the transport was a purely routine thing. But I found that climbing up the cargo net of the LST was quite another matter. At this point, huge swells were lifting the Higgins boat up to the top of the ladder and then immediately dropping to the bottom of the swell. Hesitation at any point climbing up the ladder could lead to severe injury when the Higgins boat would be pushed up by the swell. And therefore, we had to be very careful not to hesitate or to fumble in our efforts to climb the rope ladder. Each of us in our turn waited for the boat to reach the peak of a swell, and as it did, we'd grab the cargo net and scramble over the top, and we all made it without injury, thank God. The captain of the LST had sent most of his crew ashore to implement the boarding of supplies. Later at sunset, the captain announced over the ship's intercom that a Japanese aerial attack was anticipated. He asked if there were Marines aboard who were qualified to man the guns, that is 1.1s and 50 caliber machine guns. My expertise being radio communications, I watched as Marines rushed to mount the guns. Now that I recall the incident, only a Jap plane or two arrived, and they were destroyed. No guns were fired from our LST, much to the disappointment of the Marines who manned them. The following morning, a huge convoy, including 12 LSTs, formed and began making its way to Iwo Jima. Now, life aboard an LST is crowded chaos, with most of us Marines sleeping on the open deck at night. The second night I was awakened by the voice of the captain screaming into the intercom, "Machinist mate, we've lost control of the rudder. I'm going to throw you in the brig if you don't get down here immediately." He had blown his cool and raved on about incompetence. The captain had been a dentist in civilian life, and we were surprised by his evident lack of control. Nevertheless, things did get corrected eventually. But meanwhile, I was sitting and situated near the fantail, and it was in the dead of night. Much to my dismay, I saw the bow of another LST coming up fast and headed directly at our fantail. Radio silence added to the potential for impending disaster. I estimate the following LST was about 50 feet from ramming us when she veered to the starboard. We spent some time rudderless, but the so-called incompetent mechanics mate apparently knew as much about the rudder controls as his captain knew about dentistry. A day away from the Iwo landing, we were given a briefing and told to expect 60% casualties. This was it, as they say. The 5th was to take Suribachi, the 4th, the middle of the island, and the 3rd to relieve the 4th, which then was to become a floating reserve for the Okinawa campaign. There were those among us who felt they would not survive the assault. Most of us just knew we would be among the lucky 40%. Sergeant William Palmer Townsend III from Ardmore, Pennsylvania, insisted that he would be killed. A radio communicator like myself, he became the sergeant I had been acting as while a corporal, and ever since the Marshall campaign, I was an acting sergeant, and here he comes, a sergeant now in charge. He joined us on Maui while we were preparing for what became the battle for Iwo. Sergeant Townsend was readily accepted by his new comrades in arms. His friendly smile and cheerful banter made it possible for him to take charge of the section without any problems. These Marines had the battle-savvy experience of 3 previous campaigns. Sergeant Townsend had been transferred from the 5th Defense Battalion and had not received his baptism under fire. He told me from the outset that he would rely on my practical experience to aid him in maintaining team unity. He also told me that he had the premonition he would be killed. I told him that I had been through 3 battles, and the odds were more against me than him. I further expressed that if I could survive 3 battles, he certainly could make it through 1. Shortly thereafter, I was transferred to Item Battery. Captain Lefevre was the commanding officer. I didn't have further contact with Sergeant Townsend until word of his death on Iwo. Lieutenant Moose Miller and his crew of forward observers, including Sergeant Townsend, were killed when their position took a direct hit by enemy mortar fire. Sergeant Townsend was a God-fearing, intelligent, well-educated, personable, and obviously a man who would have made considerable positive contributions to his community and his country. After Iwo, while awaiting discharge on duty at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, I was able to spend an evening with the Sergeant Townsend family. The Townsends graciously invited me to dinner. Father, mother, and sister were devastated by their loss. There was little I could say except to tell them of what I knew about their son's death. The only information they had received was killed in action. I explained what I knew about how he was one of the first forward observers to take a position. I also told them how he was well liked and had made many friends during his brief tour with the 4th Marine Division. D-Day morning found us sitting in our ducks waiting for the LST bow doors to open. Infantry had already landed and was receiving heavy artillery and mortar fire. The bow doors opened to a bright, sunshiny day. It was about 8 o'clock, and as we circled the ducks, waiting for the beachmaster to signal us to come ashore, a single round from a Japanese shore battery splashed in the water of our formation. Meanwhile, the beach was being raked by devastating mortar and artillery fire. Then the unthinkable happened. We were ordered back aboard our LST, and we spent the day waiting for the order to resume our mission. In spite of the gravity of the situation, we carried on as if it were perfectly normal for us to be back aboard. Promoted to Marine Gunner, former Sergeant Major LeBlanc, an old China Marine, found his newly appointed position a bit awkward. I had just left mess and stepped on deck with a canteen cup of coffee and was stirring a haversack spoonful of what I thought was sugar. One taste caused me to sputter, and I started to dump the salty coffee overboard. LeBlanc appeared on deck just in time to holler, What are you doing with that coffee? I now have to drink coffee out of a demi-tasse cup. Give me that coffee. LeBlanc, I said, you don't want to drink this coffee? It's loaded with salt. You're kidding. You guys are never satisfied with a chow. I want a real cup of coffee. Give it to me. He reached for the canteen cup. Okay, I said, but I'm telling you, it's loaded with salt. LeBlanc grabbed the cup, put it to his mouth, and took a deep swallow. His face turned crimson, and he spit and sputtered. Damn, you were telling the truth. A Marine's Marine? LeBlanc never brought it up for discussion again, at least as far as I know, not in my presence. Later, when I returned to the same spot, the ship was raked with canister shot. Marines everywhere tried to find foxholes, only to find themselves face to face with the metal deck. The following morning, the bow doors opened for us again. Again, our ducks formed a circle, and we anticipated we would soon be signaled to come ashore. It wouldn't be until 1700. While approaching the shore, we passed on the seaside of the battleship New York. She fired a broadside. It was an all-encompassing sound, the likes of which I have never heard again. The beachmaster stood there on the beach directing traffic like he was at the corner of Sunset and Vine. The first words I heard from him were, "Get out of my sight, dig a foxhole." A volcanic ash-like sand-covered Iwo. It didn't take long for me to dig in. That was when it came to my attention that I was within 100 yards of the 5th Marine ammo dump. Night came quickly. Darkness prevailed, intermittently brightened by flares, which cast eerie shadows over the black sand. The Japanese dropped an artillery shell into the center of the 5th ammo dump. There followed explosion after explosion. The air seemed filled with screeching metal. Some reached my foxhole, and I found what it was like to be hit by spent hot lead. The first of many Congressional Medals of Honor was earned that night by a Navy chief who drove a bulldozer to the scene and covered much of the exploding ammo. Captain Lefevre sent for me at about 0200. He ordered me to take the FO team forward to the 24th Marine Command Post. I was first to locate Lieutenant Moose Miller, subsequently, as I have related, killed by enemy mortar fire, so he could take charge and then move forward to the CP. Kelly, Stitt, Duber, and Krakowski, as I remember, followed me. We warily moved toward the center of the island. The sands of Iwo were exuding a light mist. Devastation was everywhere. Blasted vehicles and tanks were occasionally displayed in the light of a flare. We came upon an amphibious tank turned on its side. An artillery shell had blown a hole in its side. The sudden glare from another flare revealed a Marine leaning against the tank. I walked over to him and asked, "Which way to the 24th Marine CP?" There was no response. He had died leaning against the tank, no expression on his face. We found Lieutenant Miller. He took over and led us forward, and much to my dismay, right into the 4th Marine ammo dump. Here he engaged in conversation with the Marine sentry. They sounded like two old buddies renewing acquaintances. There, all around us, was stacked every kind of ammunition in row on row of boxes. The effect of having been sprayed with hot metal from the explosions at the 5th Marine ammo dump was, in this situation, to say the least, rather unnerving. Miller got his directions and kept on talking. That's when I said, "Let's get the H out of here." We arrived at a large crater created by naval gunfire. Around the lip of the huge hole, Marines were hugging the sand, waiting for the order to move out. When the order came, long lines of Marines formed in the darkness before the dawn. Except for an occasional incoming round, there was an eerie silence. Iwo Jima, a 5-mile square island, limited the distances between objectives. It wasn't long before we reached the site of the quarry. The CP was to be in a Jap pillbox located a few yards from its bottom. By the early morning, our FO team found an ideal spot to set up shop. Just below the top of the quarry wall, there had been an excavation large enough to accommodate the team and its equipment. Our assignment was to coordinate fire commands from the FOs up forward, less than 100 yards from our position. Radio communication was very effective. The SR-300, a battery-powered transceiver unit, was made for this kind of duty. We spent several days at this quarry supporting the 24th as it struggled with the awesome task of blasting the tenacious Japs from their formidably entrenched positions. Minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, we were aware that the next breath we took could be our last. It was evident that the Japanese CO, General Kuribayashi, was not making an idle boast when he said he had zeroed in on every grain of sand. Yet a Japanese wild card, a rocket with a 1,000-pound warhead, became a Marine's nightmare. Not having a guidance system and without a proper method of aiming it except to point it at the ships offshore, there was no way to know where it would finally explode. The rocket was launched much like the firing of a Roman candle. A 2-wheel cart was rolled out from a cave. The rocket was positioned on a corrugated metal flatbed, which shrieked a weird metallic sound that could be heard all over the island when the rocket was launched. The psychological effect of knowing a 1,000-pound warhead is on its way caused all above ground to pale and dive for a foxhole. Months after we left Iwo, I would still cringe whenever a similar sound caused by metal against metal was heard. The scraping of a corrugated metal door, for example. Our position just below the top of the quarry wall apparently was well chosen. We sustained no casualties, but like every Marine on the island, we had some very close calls. A wild card rocket just missed our position on its way to blowing up the 24th Marine CP with deadly effect. I don't know if there were any survivors. Our duty was to continue our vital assignment. The day before we moved up to our next position, very nearly became my last. Several hundred yards to the rear of us, a tank and some Marines were working over a Japanese cave position. We could hear the rounds being fired. I'd been manning the radio for over 15 hours and was about to be relieved. For some reason, I continued to stay in a sitting position. Just as I started to get up, a round came in and slammed into the quarry wall about 6 or 7 feet in front of me. If I had stood up, I probably would have been blown in half. Our next position was at the airstrip. Here we watched the first P-51s come into land. I was astounded to see how quickly they could go vertical when taking off. No longer ensconced in an ideal spot, we were now on the relatively open terrain. Here is where we learned to have mixed emotions about trucks armed with rocket launchers. Relatively quiet conditions would be interrupted by the arrival of a rocket launching unit at the edge of our position. It took very little time to fire its rockets, and then the truck took off. Each time this happened, we would receive counter-battery fire. 240-millimeter guns, Army-manned, were brought in, and while in our final position, they came close to annihilating us. All of a sudden, white phosphorus shells began falling in our sector. The first was about 500 yards to our left, but range correct. The next shell exploded much closer, still the correct range. The third, still range correct, was about 250 yards from us. A command to stop artillery fire was given over my radio, something that is rarely done. The 240 millimeter guns were temporarily silenced. Later, we heard that the Army was firing from incorrect map data. Eventually, I was ordered to take some R&R, which was merely a walk back to a more or less safer place to be. A corpsman gave me a shot of U.S. brandy. I almost immediately relaxed into a deep sleep. Finally, the day came when we were to board the merchant marine ship Jean Lafitte and be returned to Maui to be trained to invade the home islands of Japan. Of all the sights and scenes I saw in Iwo, there are two which are etched permanently on my brain. The first took place while we were at the quarry position. It was from this position I saw Old Glory go up atop Mount Suribachi. The battle continued, but the sight of the flag crowning Suribachi removed all doubt about who would prevail. The second sight was seen when we left Iwo. We didn't know how many Marine casualties there were, but we walked past row on row of men who had made the final sacrifice. I have never seen a wide-angle lens shot of these men being prepared for burial, but if there is one somewhere, it deserves the same attention as Joe Rosenthal's immortal photograph. The real heroes of Iwo were buried there. Just for the record, the foregoing was taped in February of the year 2001.